So first of all, what does EU immigration look like within the UK? Well, first of all, 17% of the UK population were born outside the UK. There are 8 million migrants within the UK. 3.2 million of them are from the EU. And 11% were born outside the EU, 6% within the EU. And there's been an increase in migration over the years that has continued, and currently net migration is 335,000. The largest net migration figure was last June, and it's kind of levelled off a little bit, but it stayed roughly around that level for the last few years. And about half of that is from within the EU, and about half of that is from outside the EU. And I think that surprises some people, because people's impression is that most of migration to the UK is from within the EU, and in fact it isn't, and it hasn't been forever, really. The gap has narrowed in recent years, so that proportionally more has been from the EU, but still most migration is from outside the EU. But those figures actually don't also include temporary migration, and a lot of migration from within the EU is of stays for up to a year, and that migration isn't actually recorded in those statistics. So in fact, levels of migration from the EU are higher than that would suggest. Another characteristic of EU migrants compared to migrants from elsewhere is that they're young. So 19% of migrants from the older EU countries, France, Germany and so on, are aged between 25 and 34. But that's as high as 42% of migrants from the Eastern European countries, those that, that joined the EU in 2004. And really, around half of EU nationals living in the UK arrived since 2006. And the reason for that is that Eastern European countries joined the EU in 2004, and that really is what led to the big increase in migration from the EU. So you can see that non-EU migration rose quite steadily until around 2004, and non-EU migration rose quite steadily until 2004, and migration from within the EU was pretty steady, not particularly high, until 2004, and that was the time that Eastern European migrants were able to come to the UK. And the reason why non-EU migration fell around that time was because policies were introduced to restrict low-skilled migration in recognition that Eastern European migrants would meet the UK's need for low-skilled workers. I'm sure Charles can say more about that later, because he was in government at the time. So another interesting thing to point out on this chart is there was a dip in migration from the EU at around 2008, as you can see on the chart, and that was because of the economic crisis. And so quite a few migrants at that time went back to their countries, and then of course it took some while for them to return. And the reason why I think that's important is that it does show the kind of mobility of European migration. It's not the kind of migration that comes to the UK and then stays. It moves around. And another important fact about EU migration is it is largely for employment. So you can see from this chart that a total of around 72% come for the main reason to work. It's not the only reason they're coming to the UK, but their main motivation for coming to the UK is for employment. And quite a small proportion are coming to join somebody. They probably are also working, but their main motivation is to join somebody. And 13% to study, which is quite low. But in contrast, migrants from outside the EU, a big motivation is to study. So obviously there's quite a few international students here, and a much smaller proportion are coming to work. A higher proportion than EU migrants are coming here to join a family member. So I think the point of that is really the main reason that EU migrants come to the UK is to work. So where are they working? Well, it's quite an interesting distribution that you find with EU migrants. So migrants from the older EU countries, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, and so on, are more likely to be found in highly skilled occupations. So in areas like finance, engineering, science, technology, universities. Whereas migrants from the newer member states are very much concentrated in low-skilled work. That's obviously not or where it's not. That they are also working in other sectors, but they're very much concentrated in low-skilled work. So you can see some of the statistics here. So in food and drink manufacturing, you've got 35% of the workforce, as high as that, are migrants. 26% of the workforce are EU migrants. In hospitality, 27% of the workforce are migrants, and 12% are EU migrants. Social care, a high proportion, 20% of the social care workforce are migrants, 6% from the EU. Some of these figures don't necessarily seem very high, and those that are asterisks indicate that actually those figures are very unreliable, and the reason for that is that these figures are from the Labour Force Survey, which doesn't include migrants who are in temporary accommodation, who aren't living in households. And what we know from migrants who work in some of these sectors, for example, agriculture, hospitality and construction in particular, is that they often live in employer accommodation, temporary accommodation, so don't show up. So in fact, the percentages in some of these sectors are a lot higher. And another feature is that migrants are not evenly distributed across the UK, and some of these sectors actually concentrated geographically. So construction, even though overall the percentage of EU nationals is not necessarily higher in other sectors, in London over 50% of employees in construction are migrants. So there's a kind of sectoral, geographical concentration as well as the sectoral concentration. So looking at where EU migrants are working, I think this is an interesting chart because it shows kind of what you would expect, what people think that, obviously migrants are concentrated in London and in the southeast, and that's particularly the case with migrants from the older EU countries. But when you look at migrants from the newer EU countries, and by those countries I am meaning Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Czechoslovakia, Slovenia, Estonia, possibly one or two others, you can see actually they're found in virtually every region of the UK, with the exception quite small numbers in Northern Ireland, Wales and the North East. And I think I'm right in saying that there are Polish people living in every single local authority within the UK. And the reason for that distribution is that at the time when migrants from Eastern Europe were first able to come to the UK, there was a labour shortage within the UK, and that's not a coincidence. That's part of the reason why the UK didn't introduce transitional controls. But for that reason, there were labour shortages all over the UK, and they went all over the UK in a way that previous migrants didn't do. So that's why you have that distribution. So why then the reliance on EU migrants? I think we've done quite a lot of research on this issue within my organisation, and both the research that we've done and has been done by other researchers shows quite consistently that employers don't actually have a preference to recruit EU migrants. I think very much, obviously within the press and public opinion believes that employers would prefer to recruit EU migrants, that there's this idea they have a better work ethic, they're less likely to leave, and so on. But actually, when you speak to employers, that is not the case. So the main reason they say they recruit migrants from the EU is that there just aren't enough workers available to fill the vacancies that they have. Levels of unemployment within the UK are low. They've been low for some time, but they're currently, the level of unemployment is currently 4.8%, and in some areas of the country it's as low as 3.8%. In some sectors have a particular issue in that they're located in areas of very, very low unemployment and low population. So, for example, food processing and agriculture, two that I mentioned, obviously, by their nature, they're not located in areas with high population. Low pay and temporary contracts is a deterrent to UK workers. And there's also issues about conditions and image of some sectors which rely on migrant workers. So we're talking about food processing, quite dirty, cold, unpleasant conditions, butchering animals, packing vegetables, working in care homes, not jobs that really appeal to British workers. But when I said actually, first of all, that employers say there are a few differences in work ethic and the quality of EU migrants and British workers, where there is a difference, it's in flexibility. So migrants are able to flex their hours, they're able to be flexible across tasks and also with their location. And that's because they are migrants and they're here to earn as much money as they can. And then possibly go home, possibly stay. And so an employer just this week explained to me, they said, when I said to them, the employer, why is it that a British worker won't do overtime and a migrant will? And they said, well, a migrant wants to earn the money that they live on, but they also want to save or send money home. A British worker will just want to earn enough money to live on. So UK workers are less flexible. And these are sectors, the sectors that I mentioned that are very highly dependent on migrants, have a very flexible business model. So they'll be supplying to supermarkets, they'll have a very unpredictable cycle of work. And so that's one of the main reasons why they end up recruiting migrants and not UK workers in some cases. So we asked employers before and after Brexit, what would they do if the UK left the EU and they were no longer able to recruit EU migrants? So before the referendum, it's very speculative. And then after the referendum, they've gradually had to kind of think, well, actually, this is reality. What are they going to do? So first of all, their priority is to keep their current EU workers. And that's something that they desperately want clarity about. They're very concerned, particularly after the referendum. They're concerned about the future of their current EU workers. They wanted to reassure them, but they had really nothing to reassure them with. And that situation's obviously continued. Their preference is to continue to be able to recruit from the EU, but they realise that there are going to be some kind of restrictions in place. Their ideal is actually to recruit more local people, and particularly they would like to recruit more young people, but they recognise there are barriers there to be overcome. And so some of those are the issues that I mentioned earlier, the nature of the work, pay and the prospects. And employers do often also say in these sectors that are very dominated by migrants that their sector is misunderstood, that teachers, parents, careers advisors and young people themselves do not understand the sectors and the opportunities that they have. And that there are careers in those sectors. So we're talking here about hotels, factories, care homes and so on. But I think now, post-referendum, they are actually realising that some of that, the issue about perception, is partly also reality, and that they're going to have to address those kind of issues. So they're going to have to look at not only the pay that they offer, they're going to have to look at the career structures they offer, and to really attract young people to their sectors. They're also considering other options, such as older workers and students, but they do want flexibility. So students, some of you here, would be quite attractive to employers in those sectors, but they need you at a time when work increases. So, for example, food processing factories, suddenly the weather's warm and people are having barbecues, they suddenly need to recruit, they suddenly need to produce more burgers, more salads. But at that time, students are having exams, so that might not work out. They do want to recruit older workers, and I think some employers have been quite successful in doing that. But there is, when you're looking at unemployment, there's a certain level of unemployment in the over 50s. So I think there's scope there. And I think last week the Minister for Work and Pensions said that employers should be considering offering more opportunities to older workers. So that might happen. But the other barriers obviously still apply. Nature of the work, some of it quite physical, obviously in jobs like construction. So those barriers, might not be easy to overcome. Employers are also looking at non-labour alternatives. So I think we've heard quite a lot recently about automation, and a certain number of jobs are going to be automated. So we've been asking employers about the possibility of automating tasks so that they're less reliant on labour. Some see scope for that. Obviously, there's more scope in some areas than others. A robot can't make a bed, for example, can't clean a room in a hotel, can't look after an elderly person. I think another issue is that employers do want some kind of certainty around the business before they're willing to invest in robotics, because obviously it's a very big upfront cost, and they want to know that they can recoup it. And I think the uncertainty, general uncertainty at the moment within the economy, is making employers a bit wary about making those kind of big investments for the time being. But it's something that they're considering. So what policies might replace free movement? That is a big question, and much does depend on negotiations with the EU, the terms of our withdrawal. There's a possibility of a deal which would involve preference for EU workers. That might involve a kind of emergency break, a sort of cap on numbers when that's considered to be getting too high. How that would be measured, I don't know. It might also come with some kind of restrictions on access to benefits, the kind of restrictions that David Cameron negotiated just before the announcement of the referendum. But I think a hard Brexit and the government's commitment to reduce immigration to tens of thousands makes restrictions on numbers very likely. So I think any kind of deal that really involved free movement to any kind of extent is actually quite unlikely. Immigration could form part of trade deals, and so there'll be various countries who will be wanting to do a trade deal with the UK and wanting to make immigration part of that. The extent to which the UK will agree, I don't know. One thing that is pretty certain is that new immigration policy does need to include provision for low-skilled workers as well as highly skilled workers. I think first of all in the early days after the referendum, when new immigration policy was mentioned, it was very much in relation to we want to ensure that we get the brightest and best highly skilled workers. But I think actually it's realised now that the UK is very dependent on migration for filling the low-skilled posts, and that any policy has to take that into account. Partly for that reason, a points-based system is very unlikely. Theresa May ruled out a points-based system very early on. I think probably the main reason for that would just be the sheer bureaucracy involved in a points-based system. But actually it's very problematic if you try to apply it to low-skilled work. Any points-based system generally involves adding up qualifications and those kind of things, and also looking at shortage occupations as well. So I think it'd be very problematic to apply to low-skilled work. I think there does seem to be quite a lot of interest from government departments in sector-based schemes. So until recently, we had a scheme for agriculture that allowed very short stays, no dependents, with a job offer. Those schemes also did apply in food processing and in hospitality some years ago, but they were phased out because of migration from the EU. It meant that they were no longer necessary. But I think we might well be returning to those schemes in particular sectors. So they would be temporary schemes, no dependents, job offer only. And as far as the government's concerned, the beauty of those schemes is that temporary migrants don't show up in the immigration stats. And if the government sticks to its target, wanting to reduce immigration to the tens of thousands, moving over to temporary schemes will help that for sure. I think there's also some interest in having quotas for sectors and regions. I know there's been talk in London about having some kind of scheme for London. I really don't know how that would work. It sounds incredibly complicated, and I don't really see how you could stop people moving around. But anyway, so those are some of the options that are on the table. What do employers want? They want some of those and not others. First of all, they desperately want certainty about existing EU migrants, because they want to hold on to the migrants that they have. They've got different views about whether EU migrants should be given priority. So for some employers, the advantage of recruiting EU migrants is that many are genuinely mobile. So if you want a temporary workforce, you want them here sometimes and not others. And so the fact that they can go home when you no longer need them quite easily is quite an advantage. They are also more highly educated as a group of migrants than migrants in general, which makes them more attractive. But some employers actually say they don't really care where a migrant comes from as long as they can do the job. Employers don't want a points-based system or shortage list. These are employers who are recruiting low-skilled labour. They don't want to be dealing with that kind of system. They want a system that will respond very quickly to their needs. On the sector-based schemes, they have quite mixed views. So some employers think that having a scheme for their sector would be good because it would kind of highlight their sector as a sector that is in need of migrant workers. It kind of recognise their needs. But at the same time, they're concerned about quotas, about caps on the numbers that they need. They want migrants to have permanent stay as well as temporary stays, and the reason for that is that they want to recruit permanent staff to senior positions via migration route, as well as having people here for a short period. And they don't want migration that's limited to people with a job offer. And I think that has been something that's been suggested. You only allow people who've got a job offer. What employers are saying is if you had that kind of system, then they would have to use agencies. So agencies would have to go out to the countries and recruit them because lots of employers just don't have the means to recruit people from overseas to offer them a job at a distance. But overall, employers want a system that involves limited red tape and cost. So I just want to say then a final word really about how that would fit in with what we think from opinion polls and research, how that would fit in with what the public wants. So the referendum is seen as a vote against free movement. It's not entirely clear that it was. Obviously, it was about a lot of other things as well. But nevertheless, the public are expecting a reduction in immigration, particularly in low-skilled migration. Low-skilled migration is quite unpopular. It's quite puzzling to me in a way because I think, well, if you would have thought that there would be more opposition to bringing in highly skilled migrants in a way rather than growing our own and keeping highly skilled jobs for ourselves. But anyway, the public is expecting a reduction in low-skilled immigration. And temporary schemes and offering migrants permission to be here with a job offer only would reduce numbers, definitely, because it would reduce the number of dependents. But at the same time, I think it would create a lot of churn. So the public does prefer migrants who contribute, settle, and integrate. And you'll be hearing from Sonder Katwala in next week's lecture about that. So 63% of the public said in a poll that they prefer migrants who live here on that basis. Don't like people who just come in, earn the money, and then go home. The public dislikes segregated workforces, segregated communities, likes migrants who enrich the life of the UK, and are very concerned about illegal immigration. And I think some of the systems that we might be having in place will be very difficult to police, and there'll be all sorts of concerns about whether people do have the right to be here. So I think as a concluding note, I think it's going to be very difficult to get the kind of migration that employers want, that's not damaging for the economy, and that is actually going to meet people's expectations from the referendum vote.